There are many times in the history of art, particularly in the Northern Renaissance, when we don't know the name of the artist. And so when the style can be identified and we can associate works of art with that style, we give them a conventional name. It's called the master of, and then something to tell you who this person is. In this case, it's the master of the Boucicaut Hours, or the Boucicaut master. And this is the artist who illuminated the hours of Jean Le Meingre, the Maréchal de Boucicaut. So it's the Boucicaut Hours, the name of the patron, and we sometimes call him the Boucicaut master or the master of the Boucicaut Hours. This was done in the very early years of the 15th century, from 1408 to 1410. Today, the manuscript is in Paris in the Musée Jacquemart-André, which is actually a wonderful little museum. Who was the patron of this manuscript, the Maréchal de Boucicaut? He was a French hero. He fought against the Turks. For a while, he was the governor of Genoa, and he was the Marshal of France. He was also an author. He wrote his memoirs called The Book of Facts, that would be the translation of the title. And he fought on the French side during the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. He was taken prisoner and brought to England, where he died in 1421. But before Agincourt, he had a book of hours that was beautifully illuminated, and we call the manuscript the Hours of the Maréchal de Boucicaut, or just the Boucicaut Hours. It has a number of full-page illuminations in which you have a scene surrounded by this floral marginalia. And historically, the scenes are very interesting because the artist is working on creating an illusion of space. This particular artist is very interested in setting. They're very complex. There's lots of detail in them. They go back into space. And near the distant horizon, they become atmospheric. What you see is this interesting combination of conventional figures in the international style, very graceful, courtly figures, using that very graceful line that is so current and popular in Parisian illuminations. And then he starts a bit of modeling in 3 dimensions. Some places are shaded. Usually he'll have the figures in the foreground and then this expansive background. And you can say here the landscape going far into the background. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that there's these tiny little trees in the foreground. And then you have the large figures. And then you have a distant background landscape. So there is a disparity of scale where the human figures are large, and then you have just these little tiny trees to tell you they are in the landscape. There's more landscape in front, but you certainly don't want the trees to block the figures. The scene you're looking at is the Visitation, and this is from the Gospel of St. Luke, 1st chapter, verses 39 to 56. In this event, Mary, pregnant with the baby Jesus, visits her cousin Elizabeth, who is an older woman and is pregnant with John the Baptist, who acknowledges his Savior by leaping in the womb of his mother. In other words, when the baby Jesus comes close in the womb of Mary, John the Baptist recognizes him and acknowledges him even before their births. Stylistically, we can see that you have these graceful figures in the international style with the lovely curving lines, the graceful arabesques of the folds of the cloth. And the colors, of course, are beautiful, bright, clear colors. You can see the reds and the blues particularly with Elizabeth and Mary. Even though it's a landscape, this is a very courtly presentation, because you might notice that there are 2 little angels who are acting as page boys. they're carrying Mary's train. Now, Mary was the wife of a carpenter. Probably historically, she didn't have a lot of little page boys running around to do her bidding. But we must remember that Mary was the Queen of Heaven because she was what we would call the Dowager Queen. She's the mother of the King. And she's the mother of Christ, who is King of Kings. So very often in painting, you will see references to Mary as Queen of Heaven. Now, as you can see, there's two different ways of showing the space here. Some things are fairly conventional for the time. We said that there's two scales where the trees in the foreground are smaller than the people. But then when you look into the background, you see what is essentially a Flemish countryside, details of the lake, the fields and meadows, mountains, and there's even distant towers of towns. And let's take a little closer look at that. In the background, you see a very soft haze. It's what we call atmospheric perspective, where in the far distance, near the horizon, the distant landscape becomes very hazy, just as if you were looking at it in reality at a distance, and distant objects are not as precise and clear as those which are close up because they've got air between them. So here we're looking at a few of the landscape details. You can see the flocks. You can see people going about their business. There's even a little swan in the water. There's a city up on the hillside. So there's some naturalistic details in the landscape, but there's also still a certain amount of stylization. There is the gold sun, and there are golden rays coming out, and it looks like the stars are up there in the upper part of the sky, and they're picked out in gold. One of the things you'll see is that with these manuscripts, they often do use real gold to make them richer and more beautiful. Now, this is a very innovative scene. It's known either as the Nativity of Christ and the birth of Christ, or the Adoration of the Christ child after his nativity or birth. So one thing that's very unusual here is having a bed in the stable. That's not in the Bible. I can't think of any other work of art where you actually have this kind of full-fledged bed with a cloth of honor behind it and a beautiful bedspread that matches the cloth of honor. So that's very unusual. Now, when I think back to medieval art and Byzantine art, sometimes it looks like Mary is lying on essentially a mattress. I always think they look like a big poofy air mattress in Byzantine art. And so maybe that's why they've included it. It's a more naturalistic bed for the time. But what's really interesting in this is how the artist uses space. Okay, first, just refer to the subject matter. The Nativity of Christ, or the birth of Christ, is told in the Gospel of St. Luke, the 2nd chapter, the 1st through the 20 verses. And he doesn't describe a scene just like this. He has the baby who is born in a stable and is laid in a manger because there is no room for them in the inn. And so the manger becomes a kind of a makeshift crib. Well, that's not exactly what they're showing here. They're showing the Christ child has already been born. He's lying on this bed. He seems to be able to sit up much more than a newborn could. He's leaning back. He's got, of course, his halo, which signifies the radiance of his holiness. And Mary is kneeling with a book, either a Bible or a book of Hours, presumably, open, and you can see her hands are together in prayer, and she is adoring the Christ child. Joseph seems to be just stepping into the stable. He's watching over the Christ child and his wife. And then in the background, right beyond, or
maybe the middle ground, but right beyond the bed, we see the manger. Christ isn't in the manger here. The ox and the ass are able to get their food, but they're not doing it. They're not eating right that moment. They're looking over the manger and adoring the newborn Christ child. Now, I said this is very innovative in the way that space is shown. The Boucicaut master has constructed this little stable with a gabled roof and posts at every side, and then a little extension for the animals. And then he's placed this bed within it. And there's a lot of straight lines, receding view, and you can see the lines of the rafters that seem to slope back. And the lines, which would be the eaves, the edge of the roof, are sort of pointing back into space. Also the little slanting shed roof over the ox and the ass. You can follow those rafters back into space. And he's used a few other devices to suggest that we're looking into depth. One is this little wattle fence, this little woven fence that we see here. It's broken. It doesn't seem to serve much of a function, except it gives us that's what we call a repoussoir device. It is a object or person who is parallel to the picture plane in the front of the painting, in the lower part of the painting, which we read as the foreground. And that sort of marks the foreground. And then when we see things that are behind them, we're saying, oh, they're further back in space. So he's used that device. And then he has used the lines of the bed covering and the cloth of honor. Both the idea of the side of the bed, the foot of the bed at an angle that points back into space, and then every one of these striped patterns are pointing back into space. So he's using lines that are oblique to the picture plane to suggest recession into depth. Now, if you were to go and measure all those lines, you'd find that they don't have a single vanishing point. Some of you may remember from Art History Survey, or if you've ever taken Italian Renaissance art, that Brunelleschi figured out how to do what we call one-point linear perspective, in which all of these oblique lines that are oblique to the picture plane, we call them orthogonals. All of the orthogonals meet at a single vanishing point, and it's all very orderly and mathematical. Well, that type of recession into depth actually does not come to Northern Europe until the second half of the 15th century. The first artist that we're sure is using it is Petrus Christus. So somewhere maybe around the middle of the 1400s, the 15th century, or a little bit into the second half, we do see this one-point linear perspective starting to occur in Northern art. But before then, we see what we can call an optical perspective. It uses some of the same devices, lines that recede into depth, figures that get proportionally smaller as they go further back. But if you start measuring them out mathematically, you'll find that there is not a single vanishing point. So it's optical. It's not planned out mathematically. People have observed that this is what it looks like. What we see here is really, particularly for the time, a very convincing illusion of space. Okay, he's still got a few of these things that we would say, wait. He's got two little tiny trees there. Maybe we can read them as shrubs, but he still has that some references to the dual scale. But by and large, it's a very convincing rendition of a interior space, a little shed that recedes into depth. Well, let's look at the page showing the Adoration of the Magi. And you'll notice that it's the same shed, only we're looking at it from a different point of view. Now we're looking at it not at the gable end, but at the side, where you see the slope of the roof. You can see it's in kind of bad condition in places. We see the ox and the ass now enjoying their meal in the little shed on the side, the little projection, and they're on the side. And Mary is seated on the end of the bed with the canopy rising up behind her. And so the bed, now foreshortened, appears as though it were a throne with a cloth of honor behind her. Joseph is seated, and the three magi approach from the viewer's right. It's just as though he really has conceived this shed or stable as though it were a three-dimensional object, that you could move around and see it from another point of view. And the same things we've talked about before, the receding diagonal lines, the foreshortening of the bed, give us that sense of looking into depth, looking into space. Let's take a little closer look at the three magi here. The story of the Magi is not found in the Gospel of St. Luke. It's found in the Gospel of St. Matthew. And as you can see, Matthew, 2nd chapter, 1st to 18th verse. Now, the Bible talks about three wise men, or magi, that's where we get our word magic, coming from the east. And we always talk about the three magi. That's because they brought three gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So we just presume that everybody brought one gift, and so there would be three of them. They have seen a star in the sky. They follow the star, which seems to hang over the place where the Christ child is. And they say that the star is the sign of a newborn king. So they come to adore him, which tells us that these wise men are astrologers or astronomers who watch the heavens. At this time, there's probably not a great distinction between an astrologer and astronomer because they are both recording the movements of the heavens. But we often talk about them as the three kings. Now, how did the wise men, the magi, the astronomers, become known as kings? And you can see here they are kings. They're wearing crowns. They're dressed very richly. Well, it's because Christian commentators, theologians, like to go to the Bible and find verses that seem to give omens of or hint at things to come later. So the Christians look in what they would consider to be the Old Testament to find verses that then they relate to the New Testament. And they say these are prophecies of the things to come. And in Psalms 72, they find the words, "All the kings of the earth shall adore him." And they take that to be adore the Savior Christ. In Isaiah, in the 60th chapter, talks about the Gentiles shall walk in thy light, and the kings in the brightness of thy rising. And a little bit later it says, all they from Sheba, or Sheba, depending on your translation, shall come, bringing gold and frankincense. So here, someone who has come from the east, from Sheba, is bringing gold and frankincense. Well, that has to be the three magi, right? I mean, that's how they would have thought of it. And then they are marked as the Gentiles and as kings. Also, the Magi are often considered to be the Gentile world first acknowledging Christ as Lord. St. Augustine talks about this as Christ made manifest, or being revealed to the Gentile world who comes to adore him in the person of these three kings or Magi. And here you see the flight into Egypt. Once again, same things we talked about, where you have the figures in the foreground, our two little page boy angels accompanying the Holy Family. Joseph is leading the donkey. Mary is riding on it, holding the swaddled Christ child. You have your little trees in the foreground, but then you have this spacious hilly landscape going right back to the rising or the setting of a golden sun. Now, in the books of Hours, they very frequently have, of course, the prayers and responses and verses related to the little office of the Virgin, but they will also have some very useful things, such as the office of the dead, the office for the dead. These would be the prayers that you should say when people that you know have died. And here it's shown, here the image is shown, it's been called either the vigil for the dead, where people are keeping vigil over the body, which is within a coffin that is covered with a beautiful decorative cloth. And once again, the Boucicaut master is giving you these receding lines of the choir stalls, of the coffin, of the altar, as though they're pushing back into space. Now, it's not completely consistent to our way of looking at it. You say, doesn't that coffin recede very quickly? But this way you can see more things. You can look up into the vaulted ceiling, and you can look down on the floor and onto the coffin. And then you're looking sort of straight at the figures. So you have different points of view. But it's obvious that he's trying to show you an image in depth. Now, one other thing that you should notice about this is right at the edge of the scene, there is a gray stone arch. It's almost like a frame within a frame, except it's not as wide at the bottom, because this is an example of illusionistic architecture. In a church, you would call this the diaphragm arch or the transverse arch, an arch that goes across the nave, transverses the nave. And here it serves both as an extra frame for the scene, but also aids that illusion of depth, because you have to look through the arch to see the scene beyond it. Here's another manuscript. And once again, we don't know the artist's name. So what? He would be the master of the Rohan Hours. So it's the Book of Hours for Rohan. Like many of these manuscripts, it's found in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And maybe I should say something about manuscript numbers. You probably know about the Dewey Decimal System or the Library of Congress system for ordering books in libraries. Well, of course, when manuscripts first became part of collections, neither of these had been invented. It was long before. And each collection developed their own way of numbering the manuscripts. Small collections, they might just be 1, 2, 3, 4. Epernay 1. In the municipal library at Epernay, the first manuscript is known as the Ebo Gospels. It's a Carolingian manuscript, one of the great artists, I think, of all times. Paris has Paris and the Vatican vie for the title of having the largest collection of manuscripts. So this possibly has the largest collection of manuscripts in the world. And so we say, Paris, the National Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale, and then they divide their manuscripts by the language. So MS stands for manuscript. If it was in German, it would be HS for Handschrift. And if you see MSS, then that's manuscripts, plural. But here's manuscript, Latin, because this is in Latin. And then there's a number. You see 9,471. Well, as you can imagine, we don't always want to go around remembering every number, although it's very good to have a number because, you could have more than one work of art by the same artist or under a similar name. For example, they have two Bibles of Charles the Bald. For example, the Bibliothèque Nationale has two Bibles of Charles the Bald, and they call them by several different names. Once again, that's not for our class, that's for the medieval class. But here, we just call it the Rohan Hours. You don't have to know the numbers. But it distinguishes them from any other mix-up with another manuscript. This is a really unusual book of hours. We think it's dated a little bit later than the Boucicaut Hours. Dated around 1420. It doesn't have an exact date in it. But the pictures are so emotional. And really, I want to give the name expressionistic to them, where there is distortion and exaggeration that just adds to the emotion. These are very unique and original compositions. And we're going to look at two of the images from the Rohan Hours. The Lamentation over the body of Christ, and the Judgment of the Dead, and that sometimes goes under several different names. The dead man speaks to God, or God speaks to the dead man. But we'll take a look at that too. First, we're looking at a scene of the lamentation over the body of Christ. Christ has been crucified. He's been taken off the cross. But we don't see all the figures that we often see with a lamentation over the body of Christ. We don't see Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea and the holy women. We see sort of the three main human figures. Christ just lying on the ground. Mary and John. And John, this would be John the evangelist, John the disciple, is holding Mary, who seems to have just completely swooned, but unlike many other works where she swoons backwards, she's just fallen forward. And her arms, and they're very, very thin, sort of are dangling down as though they were reaching out toward her son lying on the ground. And then this very angular twisting of the head, John twists up, and God the Father is looking down from heaven. And so John is looking up toward God. The body of Christ is thin. It's emaciated. You can see the blood dripping from wounds, especially, of course, the wound in the side, but also from the wounds inflicted by the crown of thorns are dripping down even onto his chest. And the body even has a kind of greenish tone, as though it's already starting to decay. Only we know, if you were a Christian believer, you would say, but the body did not decay. It was resurrected. But it gives you that sense of suffering, that sense of he really did die. And here you see some details of John and Mary. And you'll notice the background. It might just look like a blue background, but when you look at it closely, you'll see picked out in gold, there are angel wings. And these little decorative starry patterns. And so the whole background is made up of angels in blue and gold. Now, the other scene, known as the Judgment of the Dead, or the dead man before God, or the dead man speaks to God, is for the office of the dead. In this case, the body is lying out. It's not buried. And it does look like it's starting to decay. It's emaciated. It has wounds.
but it's lying on a beautiful, rich cloth. So we might even assume that this is a wealthy man, maybe the person who owned the Rohan Hours even. And God holding the sword of justice and the orb of the earth, because he rules over all the universe. He holds the earth in his very hands, often surmounted by a cross. And he looks down at the dead man. And you can also see this angel, probably Michael the Archangel, because he's fighting a devil. And the devil has grabbed this little human figure, which is the soul of the dead man. And right now there's the battle over his soul. Is the devil going to take him off to hell? Or is the angel, and this is a militant warrior angel, which is why I say St. Michael, is he going to triumph and rescue the soul? Well, we've got some inscriptions here. Let's see what people said. You see the angel and the devil who are battling over the soul. And then we have what we call a banderole, these scrolls that come out and have an inscription on it. And of course, here's translation. And God says, "Do penance for your sins. In the judgment you shall be before me." Now you've got to remember, this is a person who's reading his devotional book, his book of hours. And so God essentially is speaking to him or to anyone else who might, in our case, be reading that inscription. He's telling him what to do, and he's reminding him that he will be up against God as judge. And there is the corpse of the dead man. He's lying on this rich, golden embroidered cloth. He's surrounded by the skulls and bones of other people. But the response of the dead man is in the inscription on his banderole. And he says, "Into your hands I commend my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord God." And that comes from Psalms 31, the 5th verse. So he's putting his trust into God. He says, "I commend my spirit into your hands, and you have redeemed me." He is relying on the promise of redemption. You remember the other picture that we saw of Christ dead. It was believed that Christ's death on the cross was a willing sacrifice for the sins of all human beings. Now, those words also remind us of the words of Christ. When he died, he looks up to heaven, he says, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." So here, the dead man is imitating Christ. He's using the same words that Christ did, not because he says, "I'm as good as Christ," but because that is where his hope for salvation lies. And you might also notice that there is a kind of visual parallel between the dead man lying, emaciated, starting to decay, and Christ, who doesn't have a rich robe to lie on, but lying there on the cold ground, bloody, thin, emaciated. In both cases, the hands almost look like claws, showing the marks of his suffering. So, the dead man is relying on the merits of Christ, whose suffering and death, they believed, would redeem the faithful. So you're seeing a kind of judgment of one person, not a last judgment where everybody comes. It's after this man's death. And you see justice, in a sense, tempered with the mercy of the atonement. The death of Christ then will redeem the penitent man. Probably the most famous manuscript illuminators whose names we do know
are the Limbourg brothers. They're three brothers who came from the North Netherlands, from the town of Limbourg. And you'll sometimes see their names in different languages. They may have been translated into English, and you have Paul, John, and Herman. Or you may see John as Jean, French, or Paul. And sometimes John or Jean will be Jan, because he's from the Netherlands, so Nederlands or Dutch. These are the three manuscript illuminators whom we call the Limbourg brothers. They worked for Philip the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, and then they came to work for Jean, the Duc de Berry, the Duke of Berry. And once again, John or Jean. You usually don't see the Duke of Berry called Jan because he's French, not Dutch. But for about 12 years, they worked for him and created a series of extremely beautiful manuscripts. There has been some attempt to decide which hand painted which manuscript, but we really don't have anything that's signed by them, so all of that is pretty much speculation. So we'll just call them en masse the Limbourg brothers, although sometimes when we look at several manuscripts, you will be seeing some variation in the styles because there were three different hands. They do have, of course, manuscript numbers in the libraries that they're located, but we've also given them names. And, for example, there is the Beautiful Hours, that you're looking at a page from, the Beautiful Hours, the Belles Heures de Duc de Berry, the Beautiful Hours of the Duke of Berry. And a scene that you will see in many manuscripts, in many panel paintings, the Annunciation. This is when the angel Gabriel announces to Mary that she will bear the Christ child. And once again, you see that the borders are taken up with floral and foliate designs, with, in this case, also the coats of arms of the Duc de Berry. And then you have your some of your text below the picture, and you have a little scene in a rectangular format. You might also notice that some of the scene, there's a little figure here of God that pops up above the top of that, the arches and the lintel at the top of the rectangular scene. But once again, you're going to see these artists who are showing the international style, courtly grace and elegance, but also with a great interest in the illusion of depth and the setting. And some really intriguing details, too. So you're seeing that idea of a kind of little space cell, almost like a little box going back through the page, back into space, with the archway at the front and these little spindly columns so you can see clearly in. And then, as you can see, the two figures are, we would say, behind that arch. You can see that Mary's mantle extends behind the central column, and the angel's wing, we read it as extending out the door or behind the arch. So we do have a back wall that ends it. The floor is somewhat tipped up, as it were, so we can see the pattern of the tiles. And Mary is kneeling at a prie-dieu, which is a kneeling bench. In this case, you have to see there's a receptacle to keep her books, and a very elaborate statue of Moses that rises out of them. You don't usually see that, but it seems to be attached to a little shelf where she can set her book and read, really at eye level. Traditionally, it was believed that Mary was reading from Isaiah, where it says, "A virgin shall conceive and bear a child." Now, obviously, we cannot see what she's reading here, but there are later paintings where you can read the text. Now, why Moses? Well, remember, Mary, Joseph, the apostles, were all first century Jews. Moses was the great prophet and lawgiver. So, he would be one of the main religious figures. And the way that the Christians looked at history, and we're talking here about medieval Christians, they saw 3 eras or 3 periods of time. The first was the era before the law. This was from the time of Adam and Eve up to the time of Moses. And there were some rules. There were what we call the laws of Noah, which are things like, don't kill, don't steal. These were laws that they thought everybody should obey. But this was when not everybody knew what the law was. And people kept sinning and sinning and sinning until God sent the great flood. And even then, the descendants of Noah continued to sin. So God decided, I've got to send them rules. I've got to send them the law. And so Moses receives the 10 Commandments. And traditionally, the laws that are in the Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Bible, particularly in Numbers and Leviticus, those are the rules. Those are the law. And Moses traditionally was the writer of these laws. So, Moses is the great lawgiver, shows people how to behave. Of course, even when they had the rules, people didn't always follow them. They continued to sin. And so God pretty much decides, well, man is not going to be able to save himself. Man is not going to be able to be good enough to get into heaven. And so Christ, God's Son, sacrifices himself, and Christ is also believed to be one in being with the Father. He is also God and man. And he will come into the world, take on human flesh, and die for the sins of all mankind. And, of course, this taking on of the flesh is called the incarnation. It's when God becomes man. So it was believed that the old law, under the era under the law, the time from Moses to the time of Christ, was superseded. It ended because the era under grace came into being at the time when God took on human flesh, at the incarnation. And that is the moment at the Annunciation, when Mary says, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord." And you can see her making this submissive gesture by crossing her hands on her breast. And there's a little dove, the dove of the Holy Spirit is coming right toward her, and she's going to conceive the Christ child in just a moment. And that's the moment when God takes on human flesh. Now, we pointed out that there's this little tower that rises up from the center column, and it goes beyond the frame. And in there is God the Father in this little architectural tower with the 2 flanking angels. He's holding the globe, and he's sending out the dove of the Holy Spirit. There's the symbol of the Holy Spirit who overshadows Mary, and she conceives without male contact. It extends up into this rich decorative border, but the little tower seems to project forward, and then you have a little painted sculpture below of a kneeling man supporting this little porch or tower up on his back, and he's a little caryatid, a figure that carries architecture, and he's leaning forward, and he's foreshortened. I mean, it's a beautiful illusion of depth. We talked about the ornamental border filled with acanthus leaves, but stylized and scroll work. There are little prophets and angels making music, and then, of course, the coats of arms, a very decorative ornamental border. The most famous of the manuscripts by the Limbourg brothers is known as the Très Heures of the Duke of Berry, the Très Heures du Duc de Berry, or the very rich hours
of the Duke of Berry, so just sometimes known as the Very Rich Hours, the Très Riches Heures. This is the most elaborate manuscript that was made by the Limbourgs for the Duke of Berry. They did not finish it. In 1416, both the Limbourgs and the Duke died, presumably of plague. And later on, there were two other artists who completed the manuscript, one of whom is known by name. But let's look at some of the pages of the Très Riches Heures. Sometimes it's interesting to see what is on the facing pages. A lot of times we see these pictures in textbooks, and of course the page is cropped. I do that frequently so we can see more of the image. And we may not be really aware what is on the other page. Sometimes that's really significant, as in this case, because you see on one side the fall of man, Adam and Eve, who are the first parents who commit the first sin, the original sin. And then on the other side, you see another scene of the Annunciation. And so that the incarnation of Christ at the time of the Annunciation redeems the sin of Adam. Where St. Paul talks about Christ as the new Adam. So here you see the new Adam redeeming the sin of the old Adam. And so the meaning is enhanced by knowing where these are placed in the manuscript. Well, let's look closer at each image. We're seeing this circular space, the shape of the universe, the shape of the world, of the earthly paradise here. It's a walled garden, and it seems to be tipped up, but then we're looking at the figures straight at their sides, sometimes a little bit looking down. It's a beautiful architectural structure in the middle. And we see the original sin. Here we see the serpent who is tempting Eve and telling her that she should take this fruit, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And then he tells her to bring it to Adam, and so she offers the fruit to Adam. After they have eaten of the forbidden fruit, they now know about evil before they are, totally naive. And they definitely feel guilty. They realize they have disobeyed God because God said you may eat of all the other plants, but not from that tree of knowledge. And so God is confronting them, and they're learning their penalty. They are to be expelled from Eden. They will have to make their living by the sweat of their brow, and Eve will have to give birth to children in pain. And so here we're going to look a little closer at this. You'll notice that the serpent has the upper torso and head of a woman. The serpent, of course, was identified as Satan, as the devil, but is often shown as a female figure because it was very commonly believed that women were more evil than men. And that's because the medieval theologians were all men. If they felt lust, it was the woman's fault. They're tempting us. I often wondered if they had had more female theologians, if they would have written the theology a little bit differently. But they said, well, Eve is the first sinner. And therefore, the greater sinner. I suppose to us today, we look at, these are totally naive beings. They do not know good and evil. They're like babies. And you would never punish a little baby. Say they, grabbed something off the counter at the supermarket, and you'd put it back or you'd pay for it or something because you wouldn't blame the baby. The baby doesn't know any better. But here, it's all Eve's fault. Well, she just had to obey. But then she's up against the father of lies, or in this case, I guess almost the mother of lies, but she's up against the person who is the most deceptive, the most evil, the devil, him herself.
could a totally naive being know about deception? Well, then she takes the fruit to Adam. Adam is another naive being, but he's not up against the devil himself. He's just up against Eve. But according to medieval theologians, the woman is more evil, and that is why she must bear her children in pain. And you may know that even up until relatively modern times, there was this idea that women, should not be given any their pain-killing help when she bears a child, because that's what God has decreed. And I think that idea seems to still be motivating some people today, it seems like. Now, we're going to look more closely at this Annunciation. There's going to be many, many paintings of the Annunciation, and you'll see that they have certain things in common of angel, Mary, often rays of light, dove of the Holy Spirit, often lilies, but they all have variations. And one of the things they're doing, once again, is showing you this illusion of space. It looks like the Virgin is kneeling in prayer before her prie-dieu at a kind of portico. It looks almost like a church. And one of the interesting things that Panofsky noticed was that in some of these paintings, you do have a contrast between the building that has round Romanesque arches and other sections that have pointed Gothic arches. Now, in this case, if you look at the pinnacle right next to it, just a little slightly pointed arch on that window that's on the left. Excuse me, it's on Mary's left, it's our right. And it may not be as clear here, but we're going to talk about that later, what that may mean, at least in certain paintings. But you do see this mixture of architectural styles. You'll remember, too, that Gothic style at this time is the modern style. They're not thinking that as long ago. That is what they're building churches in the 15th century in what we would call the high or late Gothic, depending on where you are, style. They would have called it modern. And here are two other facing pages, or these are just the images from the facing page, obviously. You have the Magi meeting at the Crossroads, and then you have the Adoration of the Magi. So let's take a look at those two images. They're both the story of the Magi. This is a very unique image. It's extremely rare. It's unprecedented. I don't think there are any before this, and rare thereafter. But the source is from a German author, John of Hildesheim, and he wrote a book, the Book of the Three Kings. And he elaborated on who these three kings were, what their story was. They, are converted to Christianity, they spread the gospel, they become martyrs, but there's all sorts of details of their story. And one of them is the idea that the Magi came from different continents. Now, this is an idea that goes back, much further. And so you often see the Magi distinguished looking as though they were the three different ages. There's a young man, an old man, and somebody in the middle. So the three ages of man, so all people are represented here. And also the three continents are sometimes represented, rather than them all coming from the East. Sometimes it's thought that, one of them came from Europe, one from Asia, and one from Africa. Later on, when they discovered the Americas, there is a 16th century painting, I think it's in Karlsruhe, that shows one of the Magi as a Native American, the feathered headdress. But at any rate, they're coming from three different places, and they're following the star, and you can see the big star up in the sky, and they meet at a crossroads.
and then they go on together to Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Now, remember, they are the kings. You see the courtly elegance. You can see beautiful decorative patterns in the fabrics, even the ones that are covering the horses. And because the Magi are kings, they're not just going to come alone with a few servants. They're traveling with an entire retinue of courtiers and servants and just people that have to follow the king. They're wearing somewhat exotic costumes with the different types of crowns. And as I said, they may very well represent the 3 continents of the earth. And as we've already said, the Magi were seen as the Gentiles who accepted Christ. And I believe St. Augustine says who make up the church, because by, of course, the time of St. Augustine, the church was heavily Gentile. By this time, of course, completely, I guess. Here's a detail in the background from the, it's very atmospheric. But it's also amazing when I looked at a picture of this that I could blow this up, and I looked at it and I said, that's Notre Dame de Paris. That's Sainte-Chapelle. Sainte-Chapelle is on, as you look at it, far left, and that is the 13th century chapel for the kings of France. And, of course, Notre Dame de Paris is very close to it on the Ile de Paris, in the middle of the Seine. And you can see the church facade here with the 2-tower facade. So it is a topographical view. It's actually a little city portrait. And so it seems that the Magi now are meeting in Paris. I don't think that's I know that's not part of John of Hildesheim's idea, but it's really taking these religious, and they would believe historical events, and placing them in their own time and place. And here's a detail just to show you. You have the eldest Magus here on his horse with the very decorative patterns on the cloths that cover the horses and the garments. And the people in his retinue have a curving scimitar, and they have turbans, to mark them as coming from the east and being, quite very exotic. It looks like it looks like the crown actually has what looks like a little cross in it, doesn't it? So we're, I guess, being informed that he's going to convert to Christianity. On the page opposite is the fulfillment of the first page. They are on their way to view the Christ child. They meet, and then they go on and, of course, come to Bethlehem. The star here, you see this little half circle that projects out of the top of the image. There's this golden star with the rays going down through the hole in the roof of the stable and going down toward Mary and the Christ child. And there are little angels up there making music, singing. And then down on earth we have this incredible panoramic landscape. Filled with people. Mary, is seated there, the Christ child on her lap. Joseph is kneeling beside her. And you'll see that Mary's on one side and the Magi approach from the other side with, this crowd of the people who came with them. Essentially, there's 2 compositions that people use for the Adoration of the Magi. Sometimes it's Mary's on the one side and the Magi approach from the other side. And then sometimes it's Mary's in the middle and the Magi are on either side. Watch for them. They'll happen throughout the course. The people, as we said, have exotic costumes. There are also some exotic animals. There are what look like little leopards or ocelots who have come with the kings. And I think that brown head, I was looking at it, is that supposed to be a camel's head? Or is it, it seems to have a slightly different shape than the horse's head.
But, this is the international style of courtly elegance for a very wealthy duke. I should tell you that this duke collected books and had them made for him. He was a bibliophile. He said beautiful books with beautiful illuminations. This is one of the things he did. And he also built castles. So, he collected books and he collected castles. Here's the detail where we see Mary. And behind her are just, 2 rows of women. Who are these people? Well, there are 2 that have halos as though they were saints, and they seem to be distinguished from the other ones. The only thing I can think of is that because Mary is the Queen of Heaven, she should also have a retinue of courtly ladies. Now, are they supposed to be shepherdesses? Where did they all come from? But at any rate, there they are. That's the retinue, the ladies in waiting for the Queen of Heaven. And then 2, as we said, are distinguished. Well, we know of 2 other women in the story of the birth of Christ. They're not in the canonical Gospels, but they are in what is known as the Proto-Evangelium. A apocryphal gospel that tells a lot of stories that you will see in artwork because they were widely believed. Stories of Mary's conception and birth, the story of her parents, and then stories of the baby Jesus, that embellish on the birth and his childhood. Things like, that's just a cute story. He makes little birds out of clays when he's a child, and they fly away. Because he has these heavenly powers even as a young infant. Well, who could those women be? In the Proto-Evangelium, Mary is in the stable. She's about to give birth, so Joseph goes out to look for some midwives. And he brings 2 midwives back. Well, Mary has already given birth by the time they come back. And so, they're going to do whatever they can to help after the birth. But she tells them that she is still a virgin, that it was a miraculous birth. Well, one of the midwives is not about to believe that, and it says she reaches out her hand. Presumably she's going to check and see if the hymen is still intact. And the hand withers. And then she believes. Terrible punishment for not believing. And Mary says, touch the child. And she touches the child and her hand is restored. The other woman presumably believed either right away or believed with this example. So they have become believers, as you could say. And presumably that's why they have their halos. I don't think there's any story that says they became saints, but here they're represented that way in this image. Very frequently, in most paintings of the Adoration of the Magi, you have the eldest Magus kneeling before Christ child. And very frequently, he is kissing the child's feet. And here you can see the child is actually placing his hand on the head of the eldest Magus and is blessing him. Here we see some of the other Magi. See one of them kissing the earth before the great king, Christ child. And I think it's kind of interesting, this little leopard or ocelot or whatever he is behaving like a domestic kitty, where they're licking their paws and they're licking themselves. I guess they want to be clean when they meet the Christ child. At any rate, you have the 3 Magi here kneeling before the child, or actually prostrate in one case. And you probably should realize that aristocrats and rulers, and this definitely included the Duc de Berry, often would identify themselves with the Magi because these are the kings, these are the aristocrats who have come to adore the Christ child. I don't think in this example, but there are other examples where people have suggested, or it has been verified, that the kings are actually portraits of certain rulers. For example, in Florence in the 15th century, Botticelli paints the members of the Medici family as the kings and part of their retinue. And there we see a detail of the golden star and the musical angels in heaven above the stable. Detail of the landscape in the background, which shows you the annunciation to the shepherds. Here are the shepherds keeping watch over their flocks by night, and they see, it's cropped out here above them, the angel of the Lord. So you're seeing several images. The shepherds, of course, their story is told in the Gospel of St. Luke, the Magi in the Gospel of St. Matthew, although it says nothing about huge retinues of people coming. It just talks about the Magi and their 3 gifts. But in a way, it makes a nice contrast between the humble shepherds and the exotic, wealthy Magi. In other words, both will come to adore the Christ child. God's not a respecter of persons, although I'm sure that probably was not in the mind of the Duke or his painters, because at that time they were really emphasizing the social ranks. Just to show you another religious scene, this is the scene of hell. Once again, it's picked out in gold. And you see the punishment of the sinners. Satan himself is being punished too. He's lying on this grill, and then you realize that below the grill in the fire are all of these little human figures. These are the souls of the sinners. He's clutching some of them. He's breathing them out into the smoke that rises up. Others are being dragged and tormented. Devils are stomping on the bellows to keep this fire going. And the way the devils are shown as sort of humanoid figures with bat-like wings, membranous wings, and horns and claws, and just that kind of hybrid creatures that are indeed monstrous. One of the really unique things this is an amazing manuscript, is it's always hard to say where is the first night scene, but certainly this is an early night scene. And as you can see, it's this dark tonality over the entire scene, and you have to look closely to see the figures. It's very elaborate, actually. We have that contrast, which at the top there's another half circle where you have a half-length figure of God the Father, and it's radiant, it's gold and red, and he's wearing this bright blue. So this is the radiance of heaven contrasted with the darkness of earth. And the reason this crucifixion, the crucifixion is shown in the dark, is because according to the Gospels, there was an eclipse at the time of the crucifixion. So they're trying to give you the feeling of what would have been natural lighting. It's dark. There's an eclipse. And so let's look at some of the details. We see Christ crucified between the thieves. Once again, his has the halo and radiance coming from it. Seems to be the light here. We do see the sun and the moon, but the sun is marked out. The moon is this tiny crescent. It's not shedding much light at all. And then down here in the corner, on Christ's right, would be our left, we see the holy women and St. John. Mary has collapsed. Essentially, there's 2 ways to show Mary at the foot of the cross. Sometimes she is shown as the Stabat Mater, the standing mother, firm and erect in her faith. But by the 15th century, it's very frequent to emphasize her suffering, that Mary suffered in her soul as Christ suffered in his body, that she suffered in her heart just as much as her son did, because, seeing the mother, seeing their child, and Mary particularly being sinless and particularly sensitive, she just completely collapses away. Even with the darkness, you can see that this is modeled in light and dark. And I didn't show it to you, but when I was preparing these and I was trying to hype the contrast a little bit so it would be easier to see, I did an automatic brightness and contrast, and it took away all that gray and gave me this fully, volumetric figures. So they are definitely there, giving that feeling of solidity. Now, you might have noticed that there were these little round shapes, and they have some other scenes that relate to the main image. In one of them, you have a medieval astronomer. We know he's an astronomer because he's looking up to the heavens, and he's looking up and trying to figure out what's causing this eclipse. You will remember that they, did sometimes think that things that were going on in the heavens, whether they were comets or eclipses, were certainly messages about important events, of course, in this case being the death of Christ. So the astronomer is looking up from his studies, looking up into the sky. And then we see what looks like a little roundel of a man and a woman coming out, and there's another man there too, coming out of the ground. These are the dead being resurrected. Now, what the Bible says is that there's a great earthquake at the time of the crucifixion, and it opens up the tombs. It doesn't say that people were resurrected. So that's quite interesting here, because he's shown here as a resurrection, and it may definitely be a reference to the Last Judgment. The other thing the Bible says was when they had this earthquake, the veil of the temple of Jerusalem was rent. It was torn in two. And so we see a little scene of this curtain, the veil, being torn into pieces. We've looked at a lot of the religious scenes in the Book of Hours. And because, of course, a Book of Hours is a devotional book, it has prayers, it has readings, it has Bible verses. Essentially, it is a abbreviated canonical hours suitable for lay people. In this case, very wealthy lay people, of course. They also have a calendar. Now, this is not a calendar that you would write your appointments on. This is a calendar of holy days, a religious calendar. And of course, the most important days would be picked out in red letters, and you've heard the expression red letter days. It's also where we get our word for holiday, from holy days. So in this case, they have these very elaborate full-page miniatures opposite the list of the days of the saints and other religious events for each month. This comes out of the idea of the labors of the months. Very frequently on medieval churches, sometimes over the archways, they would have roundels or other little decorations showing small carvings of the different labors, the different kind of work that was done during the different months. And of course, it depends on where your church is, because certain things would happen at different times, depending on how far north or south you were. For example, when you sow your grain and when you reap your grain. And they often would combine this with a zodiac, with the signs of the zodiac, showing you, God at work through time and space, in a sense, but through the time. The world goes on, people have to work, the heavens turn, as it were, or they look like they were turning, and God is through it all. So what they've done here, you have manuscripts, and you often would have a little picture of a labor of the month, but they've elaborated that. They've made full-page miniatures out of what the aristocrats did, as you see here, or other scenes are showing what the peasants were doing at different times of the year. And then at the top, you see, once again, this sort of half circle, like the dome of the heavens, with the zodiac signs. And we'll take a closer look at that. And here is another one of the scenes. This one's February, and we will take a closer look at that. This shows you some of the peasants at work. These, I must say, are very prosperous peasants, but you do see them at work, and they become very realistic. And this one has really a very accurate or very believable sense of recession into depth. Okay, let's look a little closer at a few of these. This was January, and they're having a feast day of the Duke and his courtiers. On the right, you see this sort of arc that's light-colored, and that is a fire screen. He's standing in front of this great fireplace, and to keep the heat from, just being too hot, they have a screen, and the Duke sits on the other side of this, so he can be comfortable and warm, and he's the most important person, and it really marks him out. There is on the back wall, it looks like all these armored men. Well, if you look up at the top, you realize that there's a cornice, and this is a tapestry that is covering the walls of the Duke's chamber. And it may very well be a battle scene of something like the Trojan War, but shown as though it were happening in the early 15th century. That's the style of the armor. Let's look at a few more details of this. Here you can see the detail of the Duke and the beautiful patterns of the garments, and you can see the weave of the brushes that make up the fire screen, and the golden great salt, which is this ship-like shape with all sorts of elaborate sculptural decorations. He's also got two little tiny dogs up on the table, and another dog, a whippet it looks like, on the floor on another kind of woven rug, with one of the servants cutting meat for the dog, who's very intent. So the Duke evidently liked his dogs as well. Okay, just to reiterate, it's a religious calendar. There's full page images which face the list of holy days. We're seeing the labors of the months, sometimes for the aristocrats, sometimes for the peasants, with these very realistic spatial scenes. And then there is the zodiac. Okay, this is the zodiac for February. And it shows Aquarius, the water bearer, and Pisces, two fish, in the heavens. These were the constellations, and through which the sun, I guess, was traveling. And so then we see below that lower arc with the chariot of the sun. We see the clouds are picked out in gold, the wings of the winged horses that are pulling the chariot of the sun are picked out in gold, and of course the sun itself is just resplendent gold circle with radiance coming, rays of lines, but rays of light coming for it. And then the personification of the sun is a bearded man in a long garment, and the chariot that he's riding doesn't look like a classical chariot at all. Well, this actually would be a classical reference to the idea of Apollo or Helios driving the chariot of the sun across the sky. No, they don't believe in the Greek gods or the Roman gods as gods, but they're part of the literary heritage. And so they're personifications. But, we would expect Apollo to be a youth in the nude or almost nude with curly hair. And what is this guy with the beard and the long garment? This is still a kind of medieval conception of a classical deity. If you were to read about the classical deities and you didn't have any Roman statues that you had identified with those particular gods, you wouldn't think of nude figure unless it said so. So very often during the Middle Ages and during the early 15th century, we really right up into the second half sometimes, we see classical deities represented as though they were contemporary figures. So a goddess might be dressed like a princess. A warrior, say Hercules or Theseus, might be wearing plate armor or chain mail, depending on the time and place. And so a god is represented really rather as a king, and that's what you see here. And instead of a little, Roman chariot that we think of, from Ben-Hur or something, it looks, I would say it looks like a gypsy caravan. It looks like a little house on wheels. It's kind of medieval conception of the chariot of the sun. The winged horses look perfectly classical. You think of Pegasus or even Plato's allegory of the charioteer. When do you start seeing classical figures that look like they're nude figures, they have muscles, they look like what we should think the Greek gods and the Greek heroes should look like. According to Manovsky, this was one of the things that the Renaissance did that distinguished it from earlier revivals of classical antiquity during the Middle Ages, which he called renaissances. That it was in the early second half of the 15th century, around 1460, that Palaiologos painted a series of the labors of Hercules, which actually don't exist, although we do have some small pictures that we think he painted in, as smaller versions from those. And they show muscular, nude figures. And so this is when Panofsky says that we combine classical form and classical subject. Sometimes, though, we see them with what you might call a medieval form or a contemporary form or conception, and that's what we're seeing here. Now, if you look at the scene, this really is a marvelous scene about the activities that go on during February when it's really cold outside. And I think you can see that these are quite prosperous peasants because they do have fire. Not everybody could afford that. They have the privilege of chopping down wood for their fires, or actually even to take in, maybe to sell to that little village up there. And you see a little church in the distance. You can see that they have to go out and work. There's one guy who's out there chopping away, and another person who's sort of shivering in a blanket. But they also can go inside and get warm. So let's look at some of the details. Here we see that convention that you're familiar with from stage plays or from comic strips, where you want to see the inside of a building, so you leave out one side of the building. We accept that as a convention. We don't look at this and say, oh, those poor peasants, they didn't have that side of the building. We know that the artist wanted us to see inside. And so you have, three people, quite well dressed, I might say, sitting at a fire. And they're pulling up their garments to get the heat to go up underneath the heavy woolen garments. There's a little cat who likes to sit in the warmth as well. And there's some poles for their washing because, they're drying things inside now. As I say, it's a very prosperous peasants here. Outside, you have barrels with something in them. You have grain, and some of the grain has spilled, and the magpies are enjoying the grain. You have a little sheep cot. They do need to repair that roof, but the little wattle fence is keeping the sheep in, and of course the bees are dormant. You can see the man cutting wood and the other carrying the wood to the village. And then this just really makes you think of how cold it must be, because you do have a little figure who's had to go out and take care of the farm, and he's wrapped himself up in a kind of blanket, and he's shivering. I mean, I know you can't really see him shivering, but that pose, you really know that person is very, very cold. He's blowing on his hands, and he's going to be happy to get inside again. And he's standing in front of a silo, filled with grain. So as I say, prosperous peasants. You would not expect And you would not find anyone trying to do social commentary and say, oh, the poor oppressed peasants, in a manuscript that is created for the Duke. He's going to want to believe that he has prosperous peasants. Maybe he does. I don't know. But here they are shown that way. This is April, and the spatial conception is a little bit more archaic than what we just saw. It really shows the courtly elegance, and it has a very beautiful, detailed background. But there are some things that seem awry, having just looked at that beautiful spatial illusion in February. And this is probably because you have 3 different artists working on this manuscript. So here, on one side, it's as though the ground is tipped up. It's so skewed, and you're looking down into the walled garden. But the ladies who are, sitting there in the beautiful sunshine of spring are actually much larger than the garden walls. And of course, it's a little like the way the Boucicaut master created his spatial illusions. You would have the large figures in the foreground here, very, very elegant, wearing beautiful patterned clothing. And then in the background, you have this lovely illusion of space with trees and water and a walled village or walled city behind us. October is interesting for a number of reasons. It does show the peasants at work, so first harrowing the field, and they're scraping up the field, and then sowing the seed. But in the background, you see this walled castle, and it can be identified. This actually is the Louvre. It doesn't look anything like the Louvre does today because, of course, it has been completely expanded and changed into a Baroque palace in the 17th century. But this is what the Louvre looked like in the early 15th century as a walled castle. You might notice the little details here. These kind of things are very useful for people who want to know about the history of technology. You may not think of how do you sow your grain or how do you plow your field as being technology, but it very much was so. You see it's a horse with they have a horse yoke, which is very different than an oxen yoke. They've got one of the little bits of technology is a scarecrow who's dressed up like an archer. I don't know if doesn't seem to be doing a really good job of keeping the birds away, however. They're enjoying the grain as well. Okay, we've looked at a number of examples of beautiful illuminated manuscripts. From the early 15th century, there are not a lot of panel paintings, relatively few. And that's one reason that we really concentrate on the illuminated manuscripts, and they are so beautiful, and they show us what's being done in painting. But also, of course, there was sculpture. We're going to look at probably the most famous sculptor of the North, right at the end of the 14th and the very beginning of the 15th century. So for him, simple date to learn, circa 1400, plus or minus 1400. This artist, we do know his name. His name is found in a number of documents. His name is Klaus Sluter. Klaus is Nicholas, Klaus Sluter. And he was a sculptor who comes from Haarlem in the North Netherlands. He's recorded as being in Brussels and then in South Netherlands. And then he moves down to Dijon in Burgundy, what is today eastern France, to work for the Duke of Burgundy. And all of the surviving work that can be attributed to him all of the surviving work which can be attributed to him is associated with the Chartreuse du Champmont.
Now, Champmal is the place name. Chartreuse refers to not a lime green color. Chartreuse here refers to the Carthusian monastery near Dijon. Dijon was the capital, still is, capital of Burgundy. And the Duke, of course, was very concerned about the fate of his soul. And as one of the good deeds that he did in order to hopefully help save his soul, he founded a Carthusian monastery. And there are actually 3 works of art that are associated with Claus Sluiter's work at the Chartreuse du Champmal in Dijon. One is the portal of the Chartreuse du Champmal, and this is done in the latter years of the 14th century. You can see 1385 to 93. In the center, the trumeau, that's the doorpost in the center, we see the Virgin and Child, which is, you see those in a lot of Gothic churches where you have the Virgin and Child on the trumeau. I'm thinking of Amiens right now, actually. Then on either side, you have kneeling figures of the Duke, Philip the Bold, and his wife, the Duchess. And behind them, their patron saints, who are essentially introducing them to the Virgin and Child. Let's take a closer look at that. Now, we said that the Duke founded a Carthusian monastery. Carthusian monasteries were a little bit different than, say, Benedictine monasteries. In Benedictine monasteries, in certain orders, if you were a monk, you would spend your days both working and praying. But a Carthusian monastery, the monks didn't do much work. Their job was to pray constantly. And because of this, most Carthusian monasteries are very small. They usually are founded with 12 monks. So this is a double monastery. It had 24 monks. And they have to be well endowed because, since they can't do the work, they have to have servants. They probably have lands from which they, collect the food and any rent, from the serfs. And so it would be a major financial undertaking to create this double monastery, well endowed, where what's the monks' jobs? Praying, and praying specifically for the Duke, his family. The function of all of this is to save the Duke's soul. And in this case, the Duke is Philip the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy. Now, let's look at Claus Sluiter's representation of Mary. This almost looks like an independent statue standing on a pedestal in front of the doorpost. If you know anything about the medieval churches, you'll notice that a lot of times the earlier statues will almost have the shape of a column. But by this time, the statues have become very independent, and in this case, extremely naturalistic. The pose is very energetic, dynamic. One of the things, of course, it's a traditional full pose in a sense, where Mary has her hip out and she's holding the Christ child at one side and sort of balancing both in the arm and the hip, and she's looking right at the face of the child. And that means that the body sways to one side, it gives it some more drama, and the drapery folds can often fall very gracefully, but here they're very active draperies. They seem to have they seem to be very realistic, and yet have this energy and this life. And you can see some of them pointing up to and curving around to, sort of drawing your attention to the Christ child. You have an extremely focused gaze. Mary is looking at Christ child. The Christ child's head is tipped back, really like a small child a newborn who has to have his back supported. As he gazes up at his mother, you can see there is some damage. He's lost a hand and arm and some of the features.
because this is, outside, and the rain would be falling on this figure. Then her other arm is outstretched. It may have held something like a scepter or a plant, a flower or something might have been in that hand. But that balances the pose. It creates a movement to our left and Mary's right, in that direction, that balances the Christ child on the other side and balances the fact that Mary is looking at the child. And, of course, very intently. And then when we look at the face, we say, wait a minute. What we expect is some aristocratic beauty, some dainty, beautiful woman. But, she looks like a Flemish hausfrau. She looks like an ordinary woman. It is one of the most naturalistic images of the Virgin Mary. She's not idealized into, let's take a look. Here's a couple of other predecessors of this. One is the painting I was thinking of. One is the statue I was thinking of when I said the Virgin and Child does frequently appear on a trumeau. This is at the Cathedral of Amiens, and it is known as the Golden Virgin because it was gilded. And here you see this beautiful, courtly image of Mary with her crown. She's so elegant. The draperies, just make this beautiful cascade down from where the Christ child is. So there's a great deal of similarity in the pose with the hip shot position where the child is balanced and gives it a little activity. But, how dainty, how courtly. And then, here we're moving into the 14th century, the Virgin of Jeanne d'Auvaux. Now, that was the Queen of France. And we have this little gilded statue of the Virgin. And once again, she's dainty. Her draperies fall in lovely arcs and cascade down. Here the Christ child is touching her on the chin. She forms this sort of beautiful reverse S curve of her body. Dainty, courtly, the Queen of Heaven. Sluter's Madonna, similar pose. We talked about the difference of the outstretched hand, of course, and all of the bunched and massive and vibrant movement of the draperies, but also the fact that the Virgin looks like an ordinary woman. And that is an example of the naturalism of the time. Courtly elegance to greater naturalism, the masses of the drapery on Sluter's Madonna. And they're seeing it again. On the door jamb, once again, full figure, we see the Duke and the Duchess in perpetual prayer. And of course, as we said, this is, you should remember that the monks are supposed to be praying for the souls of Philip and his family. And of course, they have these effigies who essentially represent themselves in perpetual prayer. And this would be, this naturalistic portrait of the Duke. The second work of art that is associated with Claus Sluter and also with the Chartreuse du Champmont was the fountain at the Chartreuse du Champmont. It would be a basin, and rising out of the center would be this elaborate sculpture. Alas, the thing that survives is only the base of the sculpture. Today it's known as the Well of Moses, which is a kind of 19th century conventional title. But as we say, it's basically the fountain, and the base has 6 prophets from the Old Testament. Once, the top of it supported a Christ on the cross with Mary and John standing beside him. So this was very complex iconographically, and you can imagine, every time the monks would pass it, or if they'd go, to gather water, they would be reminded of all of these theological ideas that we will be talking about. Now, why do you have Christ on the cross supported by, essentially, rising out of a base of the prophets? Because, as we said, Christian theologians believed that the Old Testament prophets were foretelling the coming of Christ. So they would mine the Old Testament for pertinent words. And they were all believed to foretell the coming of Christ. Two of them also have other kind of relationships with Christ that we will talk about. That's Moses, the lawgiver. Christ supersedes the laws of Moses. And then beside him is King David, who was believed to be an ancestor of Christ. Now, the crucifix has been destroyed. There are some fragments that are left. So here you see the fragments of the head of Christ from the well of Moses. And as you can see, it's a very naturalistic image. And we'll be seeing that also with the images, the statues of the prophets. As I said, it is a conventional name. It was given to this statue in the 19th century. Evidently, somebody looked at it and they thought, oh, that statue of Moses just impressed him so much. Actually, of course, it wouldn't have been called the Well of Moses in its own time. The iconography relates to the Fons Vitae, or the Fountain of Life. And we'll look a little further into that. Moses is present because he is one of the Old Testament prophets. He is the lawgiver, and he is seen as one of the precursors of Christ. Sometimes they will parallel things in his life with things in Christ's life. Now, what about that fountain of life iconography? In some cases, it relates to a baptismal fountain. But here it's being related, in addition, it's being related to the cross of Christ, the crucifixion. Now, obviously, I can't show you a photograph of what Sluter's crucifixion on the top of the base of the prophets looked like. But there is this early 16th century painting. Some books say it's by Gerard David or a follower. I recently found it on the web as ascribed to Colin de Cotter. And the top of it has much of the iconography that we might expect in Sluter's Well of Moses to have had. I don't mean that this is a copy of his Well of Moses. It's not. It's just the same general iconography. And you can see there is no base with prophets on the bottom of this fountain. But what you do see is the cross of Christ rising out of a basin of liquid, which here is bright red. It is his blood, dripping into the fountain. And then on either side, Mary and John. This ties it in with Christ's sacrificial death and the sacrament of the Mass, or the Eucharist. You have all of these people who have come to receive the blessings of the fountain of life. And I know you can't see it on the reproduction, but on the basin, right here where you can see the man's hand, it says in Latin, fountain of life, fons vitae. In this case, the fountain is not, well, let me go through some of the ideas. At one point, Christ is talking to a woman, and he asks her to, bring him some water. She has some, water from the well.
And he says that he will give her living water and she will never thirst. And she's like, oh, yeah, I want that. Then I don't have to do the hard work of going to the well. She doesn't really understand it's an allegory. It's a metaphor. So in one way, this living water, which is spiritual benefits. But it's not water. It's blood. It's the blood of Christ in a fountain. And of course, the blood of Christ is associated with his crucifixion, the shedding of the blood. And it's also associated with the Mass or the Eucharist or the communion service. When Christ at the Last Supper breaks the bread, he says, "This is my body." When he refers to the wine, he says, "This is my blood, which is shed for you for the remission of sins. Do this in memory of me." So they're tying together the sacrificial death of Christ and the continuation of that, the Mass, where in a bloodless fashion, Christ's body and Christ doesn't suffer again, but his body and blood are available to the faithful. And the merits of his crucifixion, the merits of his sacrifice are reoccurring in the Mass. Okay, let's go back to Sluter's Well of Moses. You may have noticed that up above the prophets, there were some angels, and you can see that there's still some paint attached to them. The angels are mourning the death of Christ. They're weeping. They're rubbing their eyes. They have a variety of gestures to show their sorrow. And that, of course, is because right above is the crucifixion of Christ. And they serve as a kind of transition. They're right below that cornice, where up above would be the cross of Christ, and above the prophets. And, of course, angels up here are talked about in both the Old and the New Testament. The material is limestone. And it's painted limestone, or as we say, polychromed, many colors. And this helps it look even more lifelike. Sluter has this incredibly naturalistic style. He really represents that new naturalism that comes into art in the 15th century. And, it's three-dimensional, so you could say it comes in sculpture first, and then more and more, as we'll see different artists working during the 15th century, it becomes more and more naturalistic. But, if you just had limestone there, it would certainly not look completely natural. So it is painted to increase the verisimilitude or to look lifelike. Now, Sluter was a stone carver. He did not paint his statues. There's a very strong separation of the specializations of the artists. And there are guild regulations that govern this. If you were going to be a stone carver, you were not allowed to paint the statues. That's another specialized trade. In fact, painters would usually paid more because they're dealing with things like very expensive pigments. They're using frequently gold. So it was the Duke's painter, Jan Malo, who painted the statues. Incidentally, we'll hear about him shortly. He was the uncle to the Limbourg brothers. Later on, we will hear of several sculptors who also seem to have been painters. Presumably, they either had to qualify in both guilds, retrieve training both in painting and sculpture, or they had such a large workshop, that they had painters and sculptors together, and this is in Germany, in Hans Moltzer's workshop, and Michael Packer. We said that the Well of Moses is a conventional title. And actually, the main prophet probably would have been King David. He faces east, and the cross of Christ would presumably be positioned so that Christ would face east. This is the altar end of a church. It's east toward Jerusalem, the place where Christ was born. The very strong convention or
tradition of associating the East with Christ. The rising sun is in the East. King David was considered to be both a prophet and a king. And you may remember that he was believed to be an ancestor of Christ. Now, the Christ is supposed to have come from the house of David. David was also the traditional author of the Psalms, and the Psalms were one of the books of the Bible that were read as prophecy. So, he here is placed with the prophets. The figure next to him, and once again, notice how very naturalistic these forms are. They look like real people. And we'll have some details so you can see some of the details of the carving as well. It's been suggested that he did use live models. Now, we don't know. One thing that also increased the verisimilitude, besides painting them, was the fact that the statue of Jeremiah, who is reading, you can see he has a book open and then he has the scroll with his prophecies. He actually did wear glasses. There were little wire-frame spectacles on him. They don't survive, but they were recorded. There are 6 figures here, so let's look at some of the others. We have the figure of Daniel and Isaiah, and then Jeremiah and Zechariah. And here are some of the details of the prophet Isaiah. And you can see, the beard, the wrinkled face, and this pouch or purse that he has with the fringe hanging down. And this must be actually where he keeps his writing instruments. See some of that. Okay. Here's Moses. And of course, Moses is a remarkable figure. You have extremely naturalistic detail. You have this great swathe of drapery that wraps the body, and makes it look extremely solid, extremely volumetric. And there's 2 ways we know he's Moses. One is he's holding the tablets of the law. One might assume that there might have been some inscription on that at one point that now has faded away. And you can see that it doesn't just look like lines carved in the face. We really have the sense of the old skin that's becoming soft and falling into wrinkles. He doesn't try to carve every hair. He has sort of locks that are masses of hair that have the carving on. So we have this sensation of this, resplendent beard, actually. And of course, there is the question that everyone asks when they see this: what are those knobs on his head? Well, why does Moses have horns? You may know of other works of art where Moses has horns. Some of you know Michelangelo's Moses statue, and it also has horns. Now, Michelangelo knew better. Why does Luter's Moses have horns? It's a translation error. And I guess the lesson we can take from this is that even saints make mistakes. According to the Greek Bible, and you may know that the Hebrew Bible was first passed down orally, then was written down in Hebrew. But in the Hellenistic world, not everybody was reading Hebrew, and so they had a translation made into Greek. It's called the Septuagint, from the 70 translators, approximately 70 translators, who translated it. The New Testament was actually written in Greek because that was the literary language of the time. So the people who were reading Latin in the Latin West would have had to refer to the Greek Bible until St. Jerome translated the Greek Bible into Latin, and it's called the Vulgate. And the reason is because Latin at that time was the common language of the people. And the same root that we get the word vulgar from, is common. It doesn't mean vulgar in the nasty sense that we have now, just simply this is the common language. This is the ordinary language of the people. So St. Jerome's Latin Bible was called the Vulgate. And that became the Bible for the Christian church in Western Europe. And it became the Bible for the Catholic Church, right up to the present day. Although today, of course, there are, translations into the various languages of the vernacular. English Bibles, French Bibles, German Bibles, all those things. Okay, St. Jerome wanted people to be able to read the Bible. And he knew that not everybody read Greek, so he translated into the ordinary language, Latin. But even Jerome made a mistake. According to the Greek Bible, Moses is coming down from Mount Sinai, having received the 10 Commandments, having spoken to God in the burning bush. And the Bible says he has rays of light or beams of light, coming from his brow. Evidently, the word for rays or beams looked a lot like the word for horns, and Jerome just wrote down the wrong word. So anytime someone reads the Latin Bible, they read that when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he had horns on his brow. And during the Middle Ages, you will find manuscripts where Moses has horns. And even after this became known during the 15th century, and certainly by the time of Erasmus of Rotterdam in the early 16th century, Erasmus did an edition of the Greek New Testament, and he found the error, and so people knew that this was an error by the 16th century. There's actually a painting in San Marco in Florence, the monastery of San Marco in Florence, by Fra Angelico. And it shows a transfiguration with the head of Moses, and there are rays of light coming from the 2 points where you would have expected horns to be. And I can't help but think that the Dominicans must have known long before Erasmus, or at least the century before Erasmus, that this was a error, because there it is in Fra Angelico's painting, and about 1430s, 1440s. Okay. The third work of art associated with Klaus Sluter is the tomb of Philip the Bold. Philip died in 1504, but the tomb was not finished until 1514. What I've read is that there's been a lot of restoration on the effigy, so people don't usually talk about it as much because they think there have been some changes. But we will look at the format of it, and then we're going to take a closer look at the body of the sarcophagus. Okay, as you can see, you have a sarcophagus, which essentially is a stone coffin, with an effigy of the Duke. He's lying there, his hands folded in prayer. There are angels at his head. There is a lion at his feet. It was very traditional in tomb effigies for the men to have lions at their feet. The women usually had dogs. Dogs were a symbol of fidelity, so it was showing how virtuous and faithful they were, and the lions were presumably showing how brave the men were. And then on the box of the sarcophagus, on the base of this, you have an architectural loggia, a series of arches with mourning monks processing below. And we'll take a closer look at that in a minute. There you see the portrait of the Duke. Here you see the other view, and one of the Carthusian monks, and the Carthusian habit is white, so it works nicely in white marble and white alabaster. This is, and you can see this beautiful architectural structure with all of these different statues of some are clergy. You can see here a bishop, his crozier and his bishop hat, his bishop's tiara. You can see various dignitaries, and you can see the Carthusian monks. There was a procession at the funeral of Philip the Bold that took place when he was first buried in 1404. And the Carthusians would have processed. So some people say this reflects the actual funeral procession. And they're in mourning. You can see some of them have their eyes downcast. Some are actually with their mouth open and crying. And just these small little figures, but they're, as I said, they're alabaster. And he uses all sorts of different poses to show the different types of sorrow, the different draperies, folds. And as you can see, some of the monks have their cowls and their hoods pulled up, so their faces are shaded, giving you a sense of the mourning figures. These are called pleurants, and they are the weeping figures, the figures who weep. And some of them you don't see the face at all, but you still have that sensation of the emotion. There is also a figure holding his nose, and presumably that's because, even dukes rot. And so you're carrying him in procession, but some of that odor is escaping from the coffin, perhaps. And so it's a naturalistic detail, but it also might have a religious meaning, that no matter how high you are, you're a duke, you will become a corpse, and that death comes to all people. Well, at the Chartreuse du Champ Mall, there were also a number of panel painters recorded. And we're going to look at some of their work. The first is Jean Malo, or Jan Malval, because he is from the North Netherlands. And he comes down and he works for the Duke of Burgundy. We don't know sometimes, people's exact birth dates. We know when he is in the records. So sometimes we'll say they're active from these days. They're mature, they're working, they're getting commissions. He is recorded in the records of working there between 1382 and 1415. After he died, Henri Bellecosse became active from about 1415. We're not sure, once again, of his exact death date, but sometime between 1440 and 1445. And then another artist who painted the wings of the altarpiece, that was the main altar, is Melchior Brodelon. And in the records, he is active between 1308 and 1309. So let's look at some of the works that are attributed to these artists. Jean Malo was a court painter to the Duke of Burgundy, first Philip the Bold, and then his son, John the Fearless. We do know that Jean died in March of 1415. And I'm showing you two pictures that have been associated with him. We're going to go mostly into this Trinity, the round picture that you see at the top. And the other picture below with the Madonna and Child has often been attributed to him as well. Jean Malot was the uncle of the Limbourg brothers, and he's probably the one who got them their jobs in France, as it were. But at any rate, there is that connection. And you'll notice that a lot of these Netherlandish artists are coming down to France. They're working for the Duc de Berry. They're working for the Dukes of Burgundy. And so there is a long tradition of having Netherlandish artists, moving from their home to go where the work is. And also that their styles are appreciated and sought out by these various dukes. Some of the records, we see that he was making textile designs for the Queen living in Paris. And then we have records of 5 large paintings that were commissioned for the Chartreuse du Champmall. And that was in 1398. He was one of the people who painted and gilded Sluiter's Well of Moses, and according to some of the records, he started painting some of the finished statues of the prophets before Sluiter had created all of them. So there must have been a push to get these works done so that the monks could have them while they are praying, I guess. Because of descriptions of the works, and particularly because the Chartreuse du Champmall was dedicated to the Trinity, it's believed that this is one of the works that is mentioned in the documents. It is a tondo, or a round panel painting. It has a sort of unusual title, neither Lamentation or Trinity, but the Lamentation of the Holy Trinity. And it combines a number of iconographic types, which we'll see. So it's dated from the last 15 years of Jean Malot's life, just generally between 1400 and 1415. We don't know the exact date. The Trinity, of course, is the way that Christians describe God. They say that God is a triune God, that he is 3 persons in one being. And by being, they mean one substance. Whatever this spiritual substance of God may be. The 3 persons are named as God the Father, who is usually represented as an older man with a white or gray beard. You see him there. God the Son, which is Jesus Christ, who Christians believe is God incarnate, in other words, God who has taken on human flesh. And there you see Christ as the dead Christ. And the Holy Spirit. And you can see sort of, right near Christ's ear, sort of between the heads of God the Father and God the Son, there's a little white dove, and that represents the Holy Spirit. But this is not just a picture of the Trinity. It combines the subject that's called the Throne of Grace, which is a kind of trinity in which God the Father holds the dead Christ, offering him for sacrifice. And he combines that with the Pietà. Which is the mourning of Mary over her dead son. And as you can see, we've also added the figure of John the Evangelist, and some angels. So this gives you, I should say, additional layers of meaning, the idea that all 3 aspects of the Trinity are involved in the salvation of mankind, and it also is involved with the sacrifice of Christ who died for mankind's sins. God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son,
that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have life everlasting. It's how the gospel of, it's part of the gospel of St. John. So the idea was this expiatory redemption, that Christ's sacrifice makes up for the sins of all mankind. This also is an example of something that we'll see very frequently in Northern art, what's known as affective piety. In other words, emotional responses to religion. The idea that when you see an image of the suffering Christ, you should weep, you should suffer, you should imagine how Christ and Mary felt. You should try to feel the same way. And so this idea of affective piety is here informing the theological doctrine. So you have both, the doctrine, but it's shown here in terms of human suffering. And one of the things you'll see in the late Middle Ages is affective piety and devotions, but also an emphasis on the humanity of Christ. Yes, he really died. It wasn't just an illusion. He really suffered. He really suffered to help you, to help all humankind.